This video is going to be about removing the engine from the E55. If you remember from the last video, I blew my engine on the track, so obviously now I had to remove it from the car. I had to do this out on my driveway because my garage wasn't long enough to put the car in the garage and also remove the engine from the front. And because I was doing it outside, I wanted to do it in one day because I didn't want to leave the car hanging on my driveway half pulled apart. I used two cameras to record this. One camera was mounted on the front of the car and then one camera was mounted on my hat. So hopefully I covered all the steps, or all the main steps at least, for removing the engine out of the car. Now I decided to remove the engine, the subframe and the transmission out of the car all as one unit because that's pretty much the easiest way to remove it. So for doing that, first I had to remove all the wires and all the connectors that were going from the engine to the chassis. So that involved basically unplugging the engine from the ECU and from the fuse box. And with that removed, all this wiring harness can basically come apart, and I put that on top of the engine so that the wiring harness could come out with the engine when I removed the engine later on. So with the wiring harness out of the way, next I removed this coolant line that's actually going to the heater core inside the car. It's just held in by this quick remove connector. You just move up this clip that's holding it in place and then the whole thing just pops out. Next I had to remove the fuel pressure from my car from the injector rail because next I need to remove the fuel hose that's going to the engine. There's just this one fuel hose that's going to the injector rail. It's held in by this 17mm nut. So you need a 17mm spanner to remove it from the car. And after that's removed, I put that aside, and then there's one vacuum line right underneath that. That's for the evap. I needed to remove that. With that removed, there's one more air line that's for the secondary air pump that's going to the engine. And I needed to put that aside, and other than that, I think there was a few other electrical lines that, like, there's one ground wire going to the power steering, and then there's some coolant lines going to the coolant reservoir that need to be removed. But after that, I removed this bracket that sits on top of the radiator. You need to remove this bracket before you can remove the radiators. It's held in place by 6 10mm hex nuts on either side, and then there's two nuts in the middle, and one Torx in the middle. And there's this wire behind this that you need to remove, and then the whole bracket just comes off. That wasn't my car starting, by the way. This car wouldn't be starting anytime soon. But once most of the stuff was removed from over the engine, I had to jack up the car, because there's a lot more that needs to be removed underneath the car, and also on the front, like the radiators and everything. So when jacking up the car, make sure to jack it up high enough so that the exhaust and other things can come out from underneath the car. And once the car was jacked high enough, I put some axle stands underneath the car. So basically 4 axle stands, 2 at the front and 2 at the back, to basically support the entire car. After that, I could remove my front tires. The rear tires can still stay on because there's not that much work to do at the rear. But there's definitely a lot of work to do at the front, so that's why the front tires need to come off. I like to slide my front tires underneath the car so that if in case the car happens to slide off the axle stands, it falls on my expensive tires and doesn't fall on me. After that, I started to remove my front splitter because I needed to drain my coolants from my radiator because I needed to remove my radiator after this. Once the splitter was out of the way, I just disconnected the coolant hoses going to the radiator to drain all the coolant. Now there is a coolant drain plug underneath the radiator that usually should drain all the coolant, but for my car, for some reason, that did nothing at all. So I just had to take the hoses off to drain all the coolant. After that, I removed the electrical fan and the fan shroud, and after all the oil hoses and all the coolant hoses and the power steering hoses were removed, I could pull out the radiators. Once the radiators were pulled apart, next I had to take the bumper off, and the bumper is held in place by these 8mm and 10mm hex nuts that are at the front of the car. And then there's this Torx nut on the side. You have to remove the fender shield to get to this. And there's this bracket that you need to pull forwards, and once you move that bracket forwards, that's all that links the bumper to the fender, and then the bumper falls off. But before doing that, make sure to remove some electrical lines going to your side marker lamps and your parking sensors. I didn't do that, and my bumper was basically hanging on just by the wires. That's definitely not a good thing to do because those wires can break off when you do that. After that, I just had to remove those brake cooling hoses that were going to my brakes, and then the whole bumper basically just came off. Now with the bumper removed, next I had to remove this front brace bar, and this is held in place by these 4 really long bolts. They're, I believe, 5/8, and they're hex bolts. And once I removed them, to remove them completely from the car, you actually need to remove the headlamps because they don't come off until the headlamps are removed. So next I had to remove the headlamps, and they're held in place by these 3 8mm hex nuts. There's 2 on the top and then there's 1 at the back. And once these come off, the headlamps basically just come off, but there's 4 electrical lines going to them for the headlights, and there's one water line going to them for the washer fluid to clean the headlamps. And with that removed, the headlamps just come off. And once the headlamps were removed and the bolts that were holding the brace bar were removed, the front brace bar just came off. There's a few other electrical lines on it too for your horn and stuff, so all those need to also come off. After that, that's pretty much all you need to remove from the front of the car. Now the front of the engine is all exposed, but now there's a lot of stuff that you need to remove from underneath the engine and underneath the transmission to basically take that off. And this is my least favorite part because the underneath of my car was basically filled with oil, and oil was dripping all over the place because I blew my engine and there was oil all underneath the car because of that. So I started off by first removing my exhaust, but before I could remove my exhaust I needed to unplug the oxygen sensors. Now the oxygen sensors in these cars have these connectors going to them, so you need to unplug them from the connector. Now that's a good thing because you don't need to take the oxygen sensors out from the exhaust, you just need to unplug them from the wires. After the oxygen sensors were unplugged, I needed to unbolt the exhaust. There's these 2 flanges that connect the exhaust to the headers, and they're held in place by these E-Torx bolts, inverse Torx, and they're at this really weird location. They're extremely hard to get to. I think that's pretty much the hardest part of removing the exhaust, just taking the front flanges off. There's 2 bolts on either side that need to be removed. And after these are removed, there's these 2 13mm hex bolts that are mounting the exhaust right at the back of the transmission. With those removed, that's pretty much all that's holding the exhaust in place from the front. And after that, I moved to the back of the car. There's these 2 rubber mounts that are holding the exhaust up that are right in front of the rear suspension. And I just used a crowbar to basically move the rubber mounts off the exhaust. And I used some WD-40, like I sprayed some WD-40 on that before removing that, because that makes it easy to slip those rubber mounts off. And with those rubber mounts off, next I had to unbolt my exhaust from my turbos because I had turbos at the back. For people with stock exhaust, you would just need to remove 2 more rubber mounts that are on your mufflers. But after that, there was just this one thing holding the exhaust in place. That's this chassis brace in the middle that basically links one side of the chassis to the other. But before I could remove that, I needed to support the weight of the exhaust using something else. So I put this hydraulic jack to support the weight of the exhaust. And then I could remove that last brace. It's held in place by these 4 Torx bolts. And once those bolts were removed, that came off. So now basically the exhaust was only held in place by that hydraulic jack. So all I had to do was lower that hydraulic jack and then the whole exhaust just dropped in place. I had a wooden dolly underneath the exhaust so that the exhaust falls on the wooden dolly. That made it easier for me to basically roll the exhaust out from the back of the car. So after that I just pulled the exhaust out. Now you can remove the exhaust in sections because there are flanges in the middle, so you can only remove the front portion of the exhaust, but I think it's probably easier to remove the entire exhaust as one piece. It makes it easier. After the exhaust was out of the way, there were these few other electrical lines and connectors underneath the car that I needed to remove. There's this one wire that supplies positive 12 volts to the starter and to the alternator, and that's held in place by this, I believe it's a 5/8 nut that you need to remove and then take off the wire. Before doing that, make sure that the battery is disconnected, because if it's not, this can short circuit. Next I had to remove this cover that's holding this connector that goes to your transmission, but for me this nut was stuck, so I had to use some other methods of removing that nut. But after that nut was removed and the connector was unplugged, next there's also a ground wire that's linking to the transmission. And you also need to remove the lever that links your transmission shifter to your transmission. The steering rack also comes out along with the subframe when you'll drop the subframe, so you need to disconnect the steering rack from the rest of the steering system, the steering column. Just remove this one hex bolt and that separates the steering column. And after that's removed, next you have to remove your prop shaft from the back of your transmission. But the problem is the prop shaft is the flex joint for the prop shaft is located right over the transmission mount. So the only way to get to that is to first remove the transmission mount. Before you can remove the transmission mount, make sure to support the weight of the transmission using something else. That's why I was using that hydraulic jack at the back. And after that I removed the 17mm hex nuts. I believe they were 17mm. that are holding the bottom of the transmission mount in place, and then there's, I believe, 13mm or 10mm nuts, hex nuts on the top that are holding this transmission mount to the back of the transmission. And once all that is removed, you can take out the transmission mount, and now the only thing holding your transmission in place is your hydraulic jack. So make sure to use a hydraulic jack that has a locking mechanism or something built into it. After that, I removed the bolts for the prop shaft. These are Torx bolts with hex nuts on the other side, so I just used an adjustable wrench to hold the hex nuts in place, and then used a breaker bar to first loosen them, and then an impact gun to just take them out the rest of the way. The transmission has to be in neutral so you can move the prop shaft by hand. After that, I had to use a chisel and a hammer to basically break free the flex joint from the prop shaft that was stuck in place, so I had to use a bit of force. But after that, I just freed the prop shaft from the transmission and then moved it farther back so it comes out from the transmission. With everything removed from the transmission, next I had to remove some things from the front suspension because I was actually dropping my whole subframe, so a part of the suspension was actually coming out with the subframe. So I had to remove these 3 bolts that hold the top ball joint to the upper control arm. And with these removed, the top ball joint just comes off, free of the upper control arm. Next, I removed my brake line that was going to my brake caliper. Either you can remove the brake caliper itself and leave it hanging somewhere with the upper control arm, or you can remove this brake line. The problem with removing the brake line is that all your brake fluid will drain, but since I was planning to replace my brake fluid anyways, I just removed the brake line. And next you need to remove this bolt at the bottom that's linking your coilover to your lower control arm. And with that removed, that's pretty much all you need to remove on the front suspension. Oh, actually there's a few electrical lines too for the ABS and for the... There's 3 electrical lines, the ABS, the brake wear sensor, and then one for the electronic damper. And once those 3 are removed, that's everything that's holding that in place. And then you can get to the job of finally removing the bolts that are holding your subframe to your chassis. There's 6 bolts, they're E-Torx. And some of them were rusted in place and they were really difficult to get off. But make sure your subframe is supported by something before you actually remove these bolts. I put this hydraulic jack. Right now it's at the front of the subframe, but later I moved it to the center of the subframe because the subframe needs to be supported from the center when you remove these bolts. And now when these bolts are removed, don't go underneath the car anymore because after this, all that's holding your subframe up is just your hydraulic jack. So it's not safe to work underneath the car anymore. So make sure everything is done actually before you remove these 6 bolts from the car. Now, one of the bolts that was actually at the back of my subframe was stuck so bad in place that when I tried turning it, it slipped and it broke. So there was no way to get the bolt off, so I had to angle grind the head of the bolt off. And it was still stuck in place, so I had to use a chisel and a hammer and basically pry the subframe apart from the chassis. And that finally broke that bolt loose. But yeah, other than some stuck bolts, everything went smoothly. And now I finally got to the part where I could lower the subframe onto these 2 wooden dollies. So I basically put 2 wooden dollies on either side of the subframe, and then the hydraulic jack was supporting it from the middle. And then I could lower the hydraulic jack, and that basically lowered the entire subframe and the engine onto the wooden dollies. And I had to lower the transmission at the same time because there was one hydraulic jack at the transmission and there was one hydraulic jack at the front. So I had to lower everything at the same time so it all basically falls flat onto 3 wooden dollies. 1 wooden dolly was at the transmission, and then 2 were at the front. I was using that wooden stick on the side of the engine just to make sure my engine doesn't rub against the side of the chassis so the engine doesn't get damaged while it was being lowered. So once the subframe was lowered onto the dollies, all I had to do was basically pull the subframe and the engine and everything out of the car. So you guys will probably laugh at the method I used to pull this out. I actually just tied a rope with the subframe and I just pulled the engine out. And this was still actually a really tight fit because the engine bay is so tight that the engine was still rubbing against some of the things. So I had to raise and lower the engine a few times just to clear the alternator and the exhaust manifold. And once all that was cleared, it was pretty easy to actually pull it out. It was a little difficult for me because my driveway was uphill, so I was actually pulling all this out uphill. That's why I had to put a bit of effort into it. But once I got to the flat part inside my garage, it was actually pretty easy to pull all this. It's not that heavy. So yeah, that's basically all you need to do to pull an engine and a transmission and the entire subframe out of an E55. It pretty much took me the entire day, or well, not the entire day, I still had a few hours left, but I was too tired that day anyways to do anything else on the car. So yeah, I just put the engine and transmission in my garage and that was it for the day. I think it is a difficult job for one person, but if you have more than 1 people working on the car, like if you have 2 or 3 friends helping you out, then it would be a fairly easy thing to do on a car. But yeah, for one person it is, I think, a pretty difficult thing to do for one day. So I finally have the engine inside my garage now, and just to quickly show you some of the damages. So this was the damage on the suspension. It was actually a bent tie rod. Luckily I think it's just the tie rod, none of the control arms or the knuckle or anything else is bent, so I think I'll just have to change that and then get an alignment done, and hopefully that should fix that. But the damage for the engine is not that simple because, well, the block is all torn apart from this side. All the oil pan is actually cracked all the way from there. And there's damage all the way to the other side, all the way till this side. I'm not sure if you can see in the camera, but you can actually see right through this engine. It's like one of those skeletal watches that you can see right through. So that's obviously a good feature to have in a watch, but not such a good feature to have in an engine block. Stay tuned for the next few videos when I'm going to be taking this engine apart and actually finding out what actually went wrong and caused all this. This is everything for now. Thanks for watching, and hopefully see you in the next part.